Every now and again, a model will come out and you just know you have to have it. Even if you don't have the army that it goes into, you want it. You don't know what it is. You can't necessarily put your finger on one specific element about it that you love. Perhaps it's the lore behind the character. Perhaps there's just a detail on there. Perhaps it's the base. Perhaps it's all of those things coming together and just making for you what you can see as only one of the most perfect models you've seen in a range. And that's where I am in this video. I'm going to tackle Abraxia, Spear of the Ever-Chosen. We're going to add this named character to his army. We're going to get her painted up in a way that's sympathetic to the rest of the army, but different enough that she stands out with the stature that she deserves. How are we going to do it? Well, you'll have to stick around until after this to find out. Hi everybody, welcome back. I'm Wayne, and I love this sculpt. This is absolutely fantastic. It's one of the best Games Workshop models in the Age of Sigmar range for me personally at the moment. I adore this sculpt. There's so many little details that I really enjoy. The motion of the tail of the mount that she's on, the powerfulness and the presence that you get from this model is something that we don't really see across the entire range. There's motion in it while she's still looking purposeful and stoic. And this is just the accumulation of a load of elements that I really enjoy the aesthetic of. As you can probably tell, I'm really excited to start figuring out what I want to do with Abraxia. And much like we did with the Turnus, the thing that I really don't like about this is the base just doesn't have the same level of grandeur that I would want. And that's absolutely fine by me too, because it gives us the opportunity to build something to tie it into the rest of his army. And that's why I love this hobby so much. You can take something, you can just glue it together, do a little bit of a sprinkling of sand on the base and you're good to go. Or you can take it as an opportunity to flex those creative muscles and to tie it into your larger narrative or story. You don't have to, but I absolutely want to, and I'm going to embrace this challenge open-armed and really have fun painting this lady. And that's right, yeah, it's great to see that Abraxia is one of the newer female characters from Games Workshop. And I don't recall, up until Abraxia, seeing very many female Chaos Lords. This model is great. However, I'm not going to use the human-like head. I'm going to go with the helmeted version because that's what we've done with the rest of the army and I want that to carry through. Okay then, so how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to tackle that base. We'll cover that at the start. The process phase, I guess. But before we do, if you're enjoying this series, do leave me a comment, like, and subscribe down below. Let me know what you think. What would you like to see me tackle next? And are there any other styles of video that you want to see me explore? Hopefully you'll have had a look at the channel and you'll have seen there's some more reviews on there, some more fun style hobby content. Let me know what you think. Okay then, let's crack on, jump on in and get building and painting Abraxia. Before we jump in and we start to look at what we're going to do with the base, let's take a look at what we've done with the model already. Now, I've built her up into a couple of different sub-assemblies. I've got the base separate and not glued down to anything because I want to make this a little bit taller. Then we've got separately Abraxia and her mount. Now, these two are also two separate sub-assemblies, so we can paint the mount separate to Abraxia, and we can just pull her right off, and then that gives us a nice, easy platform to work from for the three different elements: the base, the mount, and Abraxia, indeed herself, completely separately, and that's just going to make it a little bit easier to paint and how I prefer to do things. Right, so how are we going to do this so far, and why have I got to this point? Well, the first thing I did was build a model, as I said, into sub-assemblies and spray the entire thing black as we've done all the way through. And then we've done our standard armor recipe that you've seen in Eternus and you've seen in the previous videos. So do go back and check those out to see how we got to this point. My problem with this model is the height of it. As we've established, we're going to do something with the base in the first instance before we jump in and start painting it. Now, much like we did with the Turnus, I want to give this model some presence on the battlefield, and I want to do that by making a little bit more of a diorama style base. The model does already come on something that gives it a little bit of presence, but I want to elevate it just up in terms of look, but also in physical height. I think having a character like this that's just equal footing with some of the other models doesn't do it justice. So I really want to bring it up above them and bring out how Abraxia's stature and standing in the army just really being up there, imposing on the battlefield and look like an absolute unit, which she is. How are we going to do that? Well, I want to bring in a couple of other elements to the base. Now, we've already established that basing theme. We've talked about that all the way through this army build, and that's been central to a lot of what we've done on some of the previous models. I really want to lean into that in this one specifically because we've got the bridging element that's part of the base model. I want to give her almost like there's a fallen bit of a tower or something. You know, she was on top of a fortress. It's been smashed by a cannon or some magical bolt, and it's tumbled down, and she's ridden that falling tower and ended up on this precipice, just overlooking the battlefield, ready to smash down into the enemies that brought that tower down and wreak some vengeance and do it all in the name of the ever chosen. Right. So we're going to have to build some height in the first instance. My first thought for this was I'll use some stone, but instead I've come back in and we're going to use some of this cork. Now we used a little bit of this with Eternus, and all I'm doing is playing around a little bit at this point. I need to figure out how it's going to look, bringing in some 3D printed elements that tie the bases back together so it all has a consistency. There's some visual elements that tie it to the other bases throughout the army. And that's really important in giving consistency across everything. Even with that strong paint theme, I think having little bits and pieces that just tie the narrative together work really well. For me, this part of the process of painting and building a model is really therapeutic. I love messing about building bases like this. Less so putting them together almost. I find basing really difficult. I don't think I'm particularly good at it, but going through the process of doing it, I find really, really fun. I've got the model on there. I've had a quick play with it, and to be honest, I still don't think it's high enough. And I think what we need to do is make it even taller. And we're going to do that by using another layer of this cork. This is going to give us a really good structure to build on without adding too much extraneous weight to the model. Now, is it going to be too high? I don't know. So making sure you've always got the model on hand to position and figure out if the pose not only looks cool in terms of the wider design of the model, but does it look cool to your eye? Are you going to enjoy it being part of your army? Give that some thought. Don't do this for anybody else other than yourself. For me, I really want this one to stand out a little bit higher, and it's going to show that hierarchy going down from Archaon, Be'lakor, Abraxia, and Eternus, each one getting a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, depending on which way you do it. Now, Abraxia, in my head, seems to be a little bit tougher than Eternus. That might not be the case rules-wise, but certainly for me, she seems that way. So I want to make her a little bit taller than Eternus. Right, so another layer of cork on there, and I'm starting to get something that I really like at this point. I can see it in my mind's eye where I want to go. I'm seeing where the pools of the pink lava stuff, this chaotic energy, are going to be forming, and how that might interplay with her mount later on, and how things are going to look. Having that vision in your head as you're working towards this really does help. Now, sometimes it's fun just to start sticking bits down here and there and seeing where it goes, but having at least some semblance of an idea does work. And I can't recommend enough just how important it is to play and have fun with this in finding something that really works for you. Okay, more super glue. Let's get that on there. And I'm going to use a liberal amount of contact adhesive on this. I use it with reckless abandon for some reason, way more than's needed, but it definitely means that this base isn't going anywhere. Getting on a couple more of those 3D printed bits that I printed out right at the beginning of this project, utilizing those to tie things together a little bit more. And once we're done with that, we can start to figure out how we want to get the base from the actual model situated and attached to the platform. Now, as I said at the beginning of this, I'm in my head The narrative is that she was on top of a bastion or something like that, and it's fallen down, it's been demolished, and she rode that down into the position that it's currently laying in now. So I want to kind of lean into that as I'm thinking about where I'm positioning things and how I'm going to cover them up going a little bit forwards. And what do I mean by that? Well, building things out of cork in the first instance is just giving us the foundations. We get a lot of natural looking texture from it, so we can use it to represent rock faces and such, but we can also come back in with additional materials. So think sands, texture pastes, other types of strata that we can glue onto there to give it all of the different textures that we might see on the battlefield or in the real world. And using a mix of those is going to give us various grain sizes, and that's going to help really diversify the base and make it look a little bit more natural. Remember, in the real world, in the natural world, nothing's really uniform. There's a certain amount of entropy there. So anything that you can do to introduce randomness is going to really make it a little bit more organic and, well, yeah, looks like it's supposed to be there. So there's a lot to be said for just randomly placing bits and pieces. So as you can see here, I'm just like literally pouring on some stones, and then I'm just going to glue them in place. Whatever is going to happen, happen. And yes, I am using a liberal amount of super glue. We've already talked about this. Don't worry, I am wearing a respirator as well because it was getting a little bit smelly, and I suggest if you're going to use this amount of glue, doing the same thing. And then back to different sized sands, different sized grains. I have a couple of different bits and pieces that I use in terms of sand sizes. Some places I'll use some baking soda to really set things up. I've got some fine sand, some coarser grain mixed sands, and having a mix of those throughout the base is really going to help. Now, another thing that is going to help us as well is introducing some other bits of organic matter into the build here. What do I mean by that? Well, in this instance, skulls. And where we're going to get those from, trusty Citadel Skulls Pack. This thing is just a fantastic kit. You can find these things at a reasonable price. I strongly recommend you pick them up. They're just so useful. Okay, so I'm going to put a couple of skulls, different types of skulls around the model's base. I'm not too fussed about which they are, to be honest. I try to stay away from using too many human skulls all of the time. It becomes a little bit blasé, doesn't it? So mixing it up with some of the avian skulls, demon skulls and such, I think really does help. And it gives a little bit of diversification with the world building side of things as well. That it's not always chaos versus humans or whatever, that there's that mix of different characters, different species living in this world. It just fleshes it out a little bit more for me. Appreciate this aspect of the build isn't necessarily a step-by-step tutorial, but I don't think the majority of people need that right now. And I think just talking around the process that I'm going through myself is probably more beneficial. So as we start to add these other elements to the base, the skulls, making them look like they blend in and fit into the environment is what's going to help. Sorry about the blurry camera at this point. I wasn't really paying attention. I was having way too much fun building the base. But as you can see, I'm using a mix of different size sands. There's some rock salt in here as well. And putting a little bit of this around where I put in the skulls on the base helps to blend it in with the environment. So it looks like either they've been there for a long time or other bits of detritus has fallen up on top of them. It does bed them into the world and make it feel like it belongs and gives it that larger sense of scale and fitting in and time having passed in some way, shape, or form. So as you can see here, we've gone from what was effectively just some cork to the base. We've started to add a story to our model. Now, bringing together the plastic part of the model's original base, this bridge element, you'll see that I've added a little bit of texture to the top of it. Again, trying to blend it in with the other elements that we're creating from scratch. And that's really important in tying the two sides of the model together. And something that you should bear in mind if you're going down this road of creating more self-built thematic bases, that it's really key to make sure that both sides of the build work together in harmony. The plastic kit, the original elements with the bespoke stuff that you've crafted, and using that material that you're putting on there, the sand or texture paste, to blend in so that it doesn't just have this stark line where one ends and the other begins. it's a seamless transition between the two is really a simple technique that just gives another level, another dimensionality to your work. At this point then, I think we're ready to start thinking about how we're going to tie the rest of the base together. And we're going to do that with some texture paste. Now, we could use a couple of different ones here, but I'm just going to go back to my old faithful, since I'm going to be painting the entire thing anyway, and using what I've already got open, which is going to be an AK Interactive dirt texture, big round. Now, this stuff I use in many different projects. I absolutely love it. If you've been around the channel a while now, you'll have seen me use this on a few different projects, from the Soul Blight and the Stormcast through onto this, and even on some 40k projects. If you've not seen it before, then, well, I would strongly recommend you use an older brush. This stuff does really start to wreck newer brushes, so you don't want to use anything that you're too bothered about. But it is acrylic based and you can clean your brushes afterwards, and I just keep a couple of older brushes around just so that I can use it for this sort of thing. And as you can see, I'm not really doing anything special here. I'm just daubing it all over the base, keeping my brush a little bit wet. And the reason I do that is because it lets me feather out how the texture appears on the base. Now, we don't need to worry too much about that because, as I say, we're going to undercoat everything anyway in a consistent color, but having that seamless transition from one type of texture into another, as if they're naturally melding and mixing, really does help sell that feeling of reality. And doing so with a little bit of water to help feather that transition out is a dead straightforward, easy way to do such. You can always come back in after the fact once you've put it into the position where you want it, and then start to blend the two elements together, or even more elements if you want. You could even start to introduce some other kinds of basing materials perhaps, and other types of texture paste if you want to even go that far, but that's entirely up to you. You'll notice that I've left some areas on the base completely free of any sort of texture, and that is entirely deliberate. Why is that deliberate? Well, I'm going to come back in with a little bit of resin and just smooth that out, and that is going to represent where we'll have the glowing lava-like element later on. Now, I'm not going to show that. It's fairly straightforward. I'm just going to use some UV resin on there and then set it once I've got everything finalized and finished off. And then I'm just going to undercoat the entire thing black without giving much thought to it. And we're going to paint everything from the ground up after that, from that black base, in pretty much the same way that we've painted everything else in this project so far. So there's consistency there. We're getting to the end of the base build now, and I think we've started to get to the point where adding too much more is going to start detracting away from the overall model. It's looking fairly good to my eye. I can see where I want it to go. And once you can get to that point, I think it's important to take a little bit of a breather, perhaps leave it overnight to entirely dry, and then come back the next day and just think, is there anything else that I can add to this to tell the story that I want to tell? Or does this do everything that I want in terms of presenting the model in the way that you want it to be represented in your army, however that story works? If it does, then great, you're ready to move on and start laying some paint down. And for me, that's where I am. So let's go and do that now. And here we are then. We've got the base all done, Abraxia sat up top of it, and it adds much more presence to her on the battlefield. A quick blitz with some black primer, and we're in a good position to start working on this now. As you can see, I've added the resin for where we want the lava effects to be, and I've just primed this from every angle. There's a little bit of colour still showing through from the sand, but that doesn't matter. That will add to the variation later on. Right, let's get some colour on this then. We're going to start with Stonewall Grey, as we've done a few times now, and we're going to do it with a dry brush. Now, because of the very sharp textures on this, I would recommend you don't use your favourite dry brush here, and use something of a decent size as well, just to really speed up the process. Now, also make sure that your bristles, as we've talked about multiple times in this series, are moist enough that you're not going to get that chalky finish, because we are going to be doing a decent amount of dry brushing on this base just to get it to the point where we're happy with it. Now, you want to make sure that you're going pretty much all over this, because you want to pull out some of the different textures. What you don't want to do is go too far into the crevices where you want the natural shadows to be like quite stark and black. Having that contrast again, as we've talked about multiple times, is what makes that glow effect sell and what makes these models so simple and so striking to get on the battlefield at a reasonable pace. This differs from the other bases we've worked on is I'm going to come back in now on the other side with a larger brush, a little bit softer brush, and I'm going to start to add the same color, but with a little bit of white added into it, just to brighten it up ever so slightly. I'm going to do that for the sake of variation. This is a fairly large base comparatively to the other models that we've worked on so far, and having that variation, as we've already established in this video, is key to making something look as natural as possible. Now on this, we do have a fair bit of stone from the bridge that came as a part of the original model, and some of the elements that we've added in that we 3D printed. So having that difference in texture, difference in brightness and saturation is going to make those things stand out a little bit more and just look, again, more natural. Now you can spend as much or as little time on this as you want. It wholly depends how you want your bases to look. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. The area where I am, however, going to spend a little bit more time is on this rock element, because we don't want that to read as the same brown that we're going to have the base, that muddy, different varying tones of ochre. So the two man-made structures on there, the things that are like bricks, I'm going to use this as the foundation coat for the grey that we're going to use. And it's going to be dead straightforward to do. We don't need to put too much effort into that, but it's one that we do want to stand out. So making sure we catch those corners and make it look so that it's almost chiseled and flat. You know, you don't want to have that organic look. So again, the light being caught on the sharper edges, which is something that you don't necessarily see in nature a lot, pays dividends at this point. And you want to make sure that anywhere you've got a light source coming from, so for us, we've got the top down light from the zenithal, and we've also got this bottom up light that's going to be cast from the glowing lavary stuff. We definitely want to make sure that for the bridge elements that we are capturing all of that and that detail's visible there. Since we've already got the dry brush out and we've already got some paint on it, let's use it to start highlighting some of the scales on the mount. Now, we are going to use a little bit of a slap chop technique here, but we're going to come back in afterwards and add some more flavour and details to it. So let's not be too snobbish about that. Right. As I say, I'm going to work my way around the model, just making sure I'm picking out all of the edges of these scales. Now, one of the things that we've talked about before with some of these reptilian scaled creatures is the variation in skin tones from the softer underbelly part of the body to the extremities to the scaled part. Now, using reference photos is a fantastic idea here, depending on the look that you want to go for. Myself, in this instance, I wanted something that looked a little bit different to that reptilian look that was present on the Chaos Lord and Karkadrak, but I wanted to keep something that felt grounded in the same world. But I didn't want to go something down the road of going too trope it and going really bright on this. I wanted it to look somewhat natural and let the glow really be the defining element of this model and indeed the entire army. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to work around the model with this large dry brush. And I'm not going to really add too much more paint, to be honest, to the brush. I'm just going to make sure that the bristles are nice and moist. And that way we're going to get quite a subtle overall read on each of those individual items of the model, all of the scales, all of the details, and we can come back and we can pick out key areas once we've got an understanding of where all of the details are. So not only does this help as a little bit of underpainting, it also helps in terms of giving you a better idea of the details that you might want to pick out on the model and the ones that you in fact don't want to pick out. So there's a lot to be said for doing something like this. It may be seen as an unnecessary step if you're not going to paint parts of it, but also having that understanding of where you are going to lay paint and how you're going to paint those areas helps you understand how you aren't going to paint other areas and builds upon that contrast, those color values we've talked about that's so important. Of course, remember that there's no right or wrong way to paint. Just have a vision in your head of how you want to achieve something and how you want it to look, and then use whatever tools, techniques, and processes work for you. That said, let's start to work on getting some color down on this. First thing I'm going to do is grab some skeleton horde or some other bone color. It doesn't matter what paint you use, and I'm going to start painting that both on the mount and on the base, picking out any details like the horns, other bony protrusions like the end of the tail, or any skulls, anything like that, bones kicking around the model that I want to be ultimately a bone-like color. Now, it's worth taking your time with this and just making sure you don't miss anything, because you'll just have to come back later and do it. It's also worth considering if you want to use this as an underpaint as well, because you could also potentially put it on some of the scales. Not every single one. You could just liberally douse areas with this, and that will give you a variation in whatever color you decide to come in later on. As you can see here, I'm choosing to pick out some of the more bony protrusions on top of the scales, as I say, and that's going to help read as different color variations down the line when we layer another paint on top of it, bearing in mind that acrylics are always transparent. So it's worth giving a little bit of thought to that, and you don't want to be too prescriptive, certainly not in my opinion anyway, in where you're putting these. Again, thinking about the randomness of the real world, I'm just going to pick out some elements and go with that. So it's very loose at this point in terms of how we're going to paint larger scheme of this guy to tie it all together. Thinking about organic colors, I'm going to use some Gulliman Flesh and Nasdreg Yellow. Now, I think this specifically Nasdreg Yellow color is something that is massively underutilized. I love this for so many reasons. And looking at this guy, Cecil, Clive, what should we call him? Cecil, let's call him Cecil. I want to use some of the Nasdreg Yellow to bring out some of that organic colour. Now, over the top of the skeleton horde we've already laid down, that's going to give us something of a green-like hue that airs on the side of yellow, but where we're going to use the Gulliman Flesh. And that's a really good question. And I'm going to use it on the underbelly of this chap. Cecil has a little bit of a lighter underbelly. Now, bear in mind that this is going to be in shadow a lot of the time, and some of the parts of it that aren't going to be in shadow are going to be lit by the underlighting from the lava stuff that we've got glowing up. However, I'm still going to put it on because it's going to add a variation. It looks more natural. This color is way brighter when it dries, even over a quite dark base like we've got here. Now, anywhere where there's not scale detail is where I'm going to start to apply this. So all the way down to the end of the tail, to where the thormerizer, is it called? At the edge of the tail is, end of the tail. Behind the legs, anywhere where the arms and legs join the body, underside of the neck and the gullet, that sort of area. And this will help us establish where we're going to put some other hues and colors later on, but it will also start to give that flesh-like look and appearance to it. An area that I'm really keen to talk about in these videos is just thinking about the larger reason why we're painting in a certain way. Sure, if you're just wanting to get stuff ready to a tabletop standard or get things on the table fast because you don't enjoy painting, by all means follow along step by step with mine or anybody else's video. But if you're really invested in wanting to find your own style and understanding how you want to paint and how things interact with each other, then experimentation is key. I can't state that enough. Understanding not only how paints interact with each other, but the properties of variant different types of paint, from acrylics to gouaches to oils, and how you can layer those on top of each other and the interplay between them. You'll start to see how easy it is to build up very simple, natural looking effects in real short amounts of time, rather than just putting color A in area A and then color B in area B. You can start to be a little bit more free with how you're applying your paints to your models. And once you get over that hump, this is something I really struggled with, then it's very liberating, and your output becomes so much more natural once you start to experiment with that and give yourself that freedom that you don't just have to paint each area discreetly a given color. And as we've talked about before, I think that's quite difficult with some of the Games Workshop sculpts because they are so richly detailed that you want to paint every one of those elements. But as you can see here, I'm understanding what parts of this lizard would be a different color in the real world, looking at photo reference, and then I'm trying to replicate that in a very organic manner without being overly procedural in where I'm placing it. Understanding where blood might flow in an animal is really great to understand. If you've got any pets, any cats, any dogs, looking at how their skin stretches in different places around their bodies and understanding that will help you again. And this is where it becomes much easier to pick out what colors you're going to use, and understanding how colors change dependent on what colors you layer them over the top of. So there's a whole slew of things that you need to be aware of here, but perhaps we'll touch on that in another video. If you do want to hear me talk about some of those things and explore that in a little bit more depth, leave me a comment down below and we can start to look at some of that theory perhaps. Anyway, for now, let's get some more color on this boy. I'm not finished with the Guilliman flesh, so what I'm going to do is, while that's still drying in places, I'm going to come straight back in with the Nazdrag yellow and I'm going to start to layer that on top of all of the scales. Now, I know it's yellow, but trust me, it doesn't always dry yellow and it's wholly dependent on what you put underneath this paint. It can be a very vibrant yellow if you put it directly over a white, but if you start to put it over blacks, especially where we've started to put other bits of colours on, it becomes more of a grey hue. And that's what I want. I wasn't overly sold on the idea of going green for Cedric or Cecil, this lizard chap or lady. But with hindsight, I think I was wrong. And having a little bit of a green inside of this works really well. Why do I think that? Well, I was trying to think of what color I was going to do this thing, and I really wanted to go with a very light pink color, but I couldn't reconcile in my head how I would make the scales work with that without having something that looked not particularly flattering to my eye. Perhaps if I tackled it again, I would go that way, but I leaned more back into the natural world and I started looking at iguanas and geckos and Komodo dragons. And this is what I kind of came up with in terms of what I would want it to look like. Leaning into that Nazdrag yellow and the properties that we've already discussed, how it becomes greener but has a yellow tint to it over what we've already established in terms of base tones with the little bit of dry brushing that we've done on there to pick out each of the scales. We've already started to layer on some of that Guilliman flesh and we put some of that skeleton horde on earlier. We're going to get a nice variation in tone here. And we can always come back in with a second coat in places to reinforce that color a little bit more. Now, thinking about the process as well, it's worth understanding at this point is these are the foundations for what we're going to do a little bit later on. So knowing that you are going to come back in later and you're going to start to think about things like where you would have perhaps thinner flesh or you would have blood flow around certain parts of the body and you want to make those a little bit of a different color, perhaps with the purples or with reds or even blues, that's really going to help as well. So thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead, figuring out what colors you might want to use, and then understanding how whatever paints it is that you're going to use on your project, how they interact with each other, as we discussed earlier on, is key to figuring this out. So I'm going to go with some red and purple inks on the more fleshy parts of the body. So again, under the gullet, where the legs attach to the torso, where the skin might be thinner and more translucent, but also where there's more likelihood for blood to be flowing and such. So not necessarily on the scales, but on the elbows, on the fingers, on um the tail where it's attaching to the body, that sort of thing. Again, that brings out more of the natural look to this, and using reference and just checking out your own animals to figure this one out is really going to be helpful. Also thinking about how we're going to darken elements of the armor down as well. So we don't want everything to kind of smudge together, but we don't want things to start standing out too starkly because, well, we want it to be nice and contrasty, don't we, for the glow later on without losing too much detail. So work your way around the model if you're going to follow on with this. Again, keeping your brush nice and moist so that we aren't going in too heavy with this color because it is very highly pigmented. Keep your brush nice and moist and just have fun with applying the paint to the model where you think it looks natural. If it starts to not look natural, just stop and move on to the next step. We can always fix something later on. Don't think that you've ruined something. You've absolutely not. It's pretty much impossible to ruin something with a paint scheme. You can always just paint back over it, can't you? Let's start to pick out some details then. The leather straps in the first instance, I'm going to use a contrast paint, a dark brown contrast wildwood, but any will do. And I'm going to do that across the mount and also across Abraxia. And I'm going to use the same color to pick out any of the root details on the base as well. If you've added anything yourself, do that at this point as well. So any kind of vines or anything like that. Let's do a little work on Abraxia then. And as you'll notice, I've done a little work on a cape already. And I've done this in exactly the same way as I set up the capes of the Chaos Warriors way back earlier in the series. So if you've not seen that, jump back and have a look at the Chaos Warriors video and you'll see exactly how we've done this. There's no point in retreading water. Right, so what we're going to do then to make Abraxia stand out a little bit, I'm going to basically repeat the steps that we've done on the mount. I'm going to use a little bit of a Guilliman flesh and some of that Nazdrag yellow on this part of her cape that looks a little bit like it might belong to the same sort of beast, whatever it is that she's riding into battle. So I want to carry that over. I could have done this at the same time if I'd have thought about it, to be totally honest, but it's easy enough to do now. The paints are still out, so nice and easily rectified, isn't it? And we're going to be quite careful at this point. I'm doing a little bit different is going backwards and forwards between the Nazdrag yellow and the Guilliman flesh, just making it look a little bit more seamless than I did on the mount. The reason being there, this is a smaller area. I want it to be a little bit more subtle, but I still want to have that gradation between the Guilliman flesh and the Nazdrag yellow of the skin of whatever lizard it is, whatever hides thrown over her shoulder. Right. Now she's got a little bit of colour on her, we've started, so let's get on to the next part with her and tackle this cape. And if you think you've seen this before, you will be right. If you remember back to the Sorcerer's video, we did something very similar here, and we're going to use burgundy and blue. You'll recall that previously all the capes have been blue. Now she's a little bit different, she's a character, and we got some of this blend done on Eternus, didn't we? We did it on his banners, so pulling this through to be part of the more elite elements of the army is going to give us a little bit of a visual break in terms of what that hierarchy looks like, while still having a nod from the blue to the wider army color theme. Now, be careful with these two colors. They are very highly pigmented and you're going to have to work fast. I'm sorry the framing isn't ideal on this. Yeah, I could have, it's my fault. There's no excuse. I have no excuse. But you've seen me do it a couple of times now. I prefer to start with the red and then work it into the blue, keeping my brush nice and moist, keeping that pot of water next to me, and then just working backwards and forwards, increasing the saturation at each of the end points, and then pulling them together with a blend in the middle. If your blend isn't as smooth as you would want, then you can come back in later on and you could glaze over the top of it. That's not a problem with a unifying color to bring them together and just smooth out those transitions. But what you've got to be aware of is that contrast paint, speed paint does dry fairly fast. And if you continue to work the paint, then it will start to rip and give you micro textures. You may want that. It'll add a little bit of interest. But in my case for this one, I didn't want it. I wanted the cape to almost look ethereal or spectral in some respect. And that is a pullback to the sorcerers, thinking that this is perhaps a material that changes color as the light hits it. I just really liked that idea. And you want to work on both the outside and the inside. Try and be as careful as possible here. I would strongly recommend using a large brush with decent bristles so that you don't start to get any of this paint on the armor elements that you've already built up, because that will be an issue. Just be careful with highly pigmented paints. Sigvald Burgundy is insanely pigmented and it stains like nobody's business. So yeah, just be careful what you're doing. Can't stress enough how important it is to keep your brush damp through this entire process. It makes it way easier. Again, work as fast as you can without being sloppy. I strongly recommend trying this on a piece of scrap paper. If you've got some photo paper, that is a great proxy for putting that on your model and getting your blend down pat. If you don't have that, any paper will do, but if you're not overly comfortable with it, I would strongly recommend practicing before you mess up your model if you're bothered about the finish of it. Onto the armor then, and I'm going to use Black Legion, another contrast paint, but any black paint will do, or even black ink. I'm going to very carefully apply this around the model now. So I've dropped down to a smaller brush. I'm using a medium layer brush, I think it is, but any decent brush with a good tip will do here, and this is where you want to start taking some time. For Abraxia's armor, I want it to read inky black, so I'm going to do it in a couple of layers. I'll come back and perhaps do 2, maybe even 3 layers around each armor panel, letting each one completely dry fully. So that gives me a nice smooth surface to work over the top. As I say, be as careful as possible here. That's what's going to make it stand out. When it comes to her mount, I'm only going to do 1 or 2 layers, probably just 1, and I'm going to do it in a much thinner coat as well because I want the metallic that we already established there to read through. Why we're going to do that is that it will give us 2 versions of black that will read differently to the eye. So it will pick Abraxia out against the mount while still giving a consistency in terms of the black armor panel to make them look like one coherent unit, almost like different materials perhaps. You could, if you wanted, do some inner highlighting as well on the armor panels. I'm choosing not to. I like the look of just flat black armor against the gold trim in this instance. And I'm not going to do anything additional to the gold trim either. I'm going to keep it at the level that it's at the moment. The reason being, thinking about the character Abraxia there, her martial prowess is utmost to her. That's the thing that's most important. And so polishing armor for hours on end to get this really vibrant golden look, which is something that I can think of Eternus doing because he's got that much more ornate baroque armor that seems to lend itself more towards that arrogance that comes with having something so highly polished, whereas Abraxia seems to be more form and function, in which case I want to keep it more subdued almost. So we've still got some really highly decorative details on here, but we're not going to pull it too far in the other direction. And again, that's going to help us give us a little bit of differentiation between Abraxia and Eternus as well, because they're almost equivalent, I suppose, in terms of utility and function in the game itself. So having them almost be the same but different in paint schemes and styles works for us quite well, I think. Let's pick out Abraxia's shield, and we're going to do that in the same way that we've done all the way through this tutorial with the Chaos Warriors. And I'm going to use a blue ink just to filter over the top of what we've already established with this. So the nice tie back to the Chaos Warriors, Chosen, and everything else we've had in the army, bringing through a little bit more consistency. Now we have a little bit more detail here that we're going to pick out later on, but the next thing we need to do is to start thinking about where we're going to have the glows coming from. And we're going to do that in the same way as we have all the way through, using some thinned down white ink. Now let's start off with Abraxia, and well, straight away we're going to do a rise. We've got the parts on our spear that's all cracked and such, and this fire that's coming out of it, and we've also got a couple of glyphs, haven't we, around the armor. So making sure we're picking those out with some of this white ink. If you need to thin it down a little bit more, add some more water and do multiple coats of it. It's not a problem. Try not to splodge it anywhere like I've just done, and if you have, just wick it away dead fast. Now we need to do a rise as well, and there's a load of cracks around her shield that we want to read as the glowing color as well. So for us, that's going to be pink. Now we want to do this on Abraxia and onto the dragon thing, mount, lizard, whatever it is, and also on the base as well. And we're going to do it on the base by pulling out the airbrush, so we'll do that in a moment. Now, normally this is the final step before we get on to seeing what the final model looks like. But in this case, we're going to have a couple of steps after we've done the glow. The reason being is this being a central unit, a character model, we want to add a little bit more detail, a few flourishes here and there, especially on the mount as well, because we've not actually done that much work if you think about it at this point. So coming back in after the fact and picking out details that we want to really pop that aren't going to be lost is really worthwhile. So let's just have a quick gloss over the glowing section, because we've done this multiple times. Do go back and check out some of the other videos now. They should have a good understanding of how to do this. What I do recommend for the glows on the character models though is adding a couple of separate steps in there. So rather than doing just perhaps 2 passes backwards and forwards, you could do 3, 4, even 5 passes. You might want to think about adding a little bit more contrast, coming back in and dry brushing the edge of the flames, so the darker at the tips. Whatever it is that you want to do that's going to make them yours. Now, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going for this flame smoke effect. I want it to be almost like a magic. So rather than having it almost like a fire where it would be naturally darker at the wispy bit, I'm going to have it basically read as all glowing. A slight change in tone of hue, so it'll still be the pink, but it'll not be quite as bright at the tips. So there will be some cooling off, but nothing like going to a black or anything like that. Before we do anything else with the glow, let's grab some Umbra ink or a sepia, a dark brown, whatever it's going to be, and let's work on the base. So I'm just going to basically work around through the airbrush with this, applying different layers of paint, a little bit darker in some places, a little bit lighter in others. With some precision, I'm trying not to get too close to the lava stuff at the bottom, and I don't want to obviously go over the skulls that I've painted on there. A little bit of overspray is fine, it helps blend it in, but just thinking about the different tones that you want to end up with here. So because we've got multiple layers of different kind of strata on here, we want things to read a little bit differently. And there will be some absorption of the paint here, so you will get some natural variation, but obviously as you work in thin layers, you can start to really increase the saturation in some places compared to others. So think about where the shadows would be. If you've got some recesses and want to get some color in there, do a couple of thin coats inside of there to build up the natural darker tones. Try to avoid the stony areas that you want to read as grey later on. But if you do get some overspray, don't worry about it. It looks like dust. It's not a complete loss if you do that. You don't have to start repainting anything. You could even come in with some pigments at this point if you wanted to. I would have done that normally if I'd have put that on all of the other bases, but we've not. So this would kind of make it look a little bit out of place, even though I think this base would really lend itself to some pigments on here as well. But hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? Nothing's perfect, but yeah. Work your way around, get it to a level that you're happy with so that you're starting to see various individual details without everything popping out and looking completely different hue and color. So you want it to look, as we've said before multiple times now, natural. Using photo reference is a massive help to me. So I do recommend you have a screen next to an iPad, a phone, a computer, whatever, and you can just bring up some elements on there that you can draw inspiration from. Since we've already got our airbrush out, let's start to put a little bit more colour on the mount as well. So I'm going to use a little bit of red ink here, and I'm going to do what I said earlier and start to introduce a little bit of colour where I think the skin would be thinner and there'd be perhaps a little bit more blood flow. So thinking about where there would be joints on the elbow, underside of the gullet, where the skin is a little bit thinner there, not necessarily a joint, but it would be a different colour when you look at your photo reference. On the knees, the back of the legs, etc. And you could even start to bring in a little bit of colour on the underside where we put that gulum and flesh in, and that's exactly what I'm going to start to do. Now, if you oversaturate an area, don't worry, you can knock it back later on, bearing in mind that it's much easier to add paint than it is to take paint off, so try to avoid going too heavy if you can, but sometimes it's just, it happens, it's an accident, and in which case, don't stress too much about it. We can fix it later, it just means a little bit more effort. Where this is going to be placed specifically on a model, I'm not entirely sure. I'm going to go with rule of cool. We've done that a number of times, haven't we, in this project so far? So you do what you think looks good and natural to you. I've used a little bit of photo reference to take inspiration from here, but I'm not going to follow that solidly in any way, shape, or form. I'm just going to start to try and make something that looks natural to my eye, that fits in with the world that I think this guy would live in, and hopefully I'll end up with something that looks pretty cool. Just be careful, make sure the tip of your airbrush is nice and clean at all times so your paint is going where exactly you want it to go, and don't be too heavy. Thin coats are easier to build up. As I've said 1,000 times now, adding more paint is way easier than taking paint away. Now, obviously, an area that I do want to get some colour on is around the mouth, and we're going to want to draw some attention to the mouth, aren't we, later on? So being as careful as possible, but I'm still being fairly loose with the airbrush at this point. If you're not overly comfortable with your airbrush and being a little bit more detailed, then perhaps you might want to come in with a brush to do this part. Building up the glow effect then, I'm going to gloss over because we have, as I've said, covered it many times in previous videos, so do jump back and check some of those older videos out, and also check out the specific glow that we did right at the beginning. I'm just going to work around with the white, and then we're going to use that really vibrant pink color, the fluorescent, and we're going to go backwards and forwards between the white and that color and the brush, picking out the hotter, warmer spots that we want to read as brighter and brighter and brighter. And I'm going to do that somewhere between 3 and 5 times, probably 5 times on this model because it's standing out a little bit more. It's a character unit. Once I've done that, then I'm going to come back in and we're going to start looking at some details, and we're almost there with it now, guys. Welcome back if you took a break to check out some of the earlier videos on how to do that glow. What we're going to do now is pick out the final details, and I'm going to use my wet palette, and I've got a number of colors that I've already used throughout this project set up on there. Which colors in particular are going to depend on how you've painted your model yourself. For me, I'm going to start working on picking out the face of this lizard and some other key details around the model. Using a bone white first, picking out the teeth, and I'm going to also start to pick out a little bit more detail on some of the glow areas. So as you'll see on the shield, it's not quite as bright as I would want it, but I want to pick out the actual edges of where the cracks are in the shield with a little bit of edge highlighting. We won't go into too much detail on that. You know how to edge highlight by now. It's super simple. Just be careful. Use a decent brush here with a good tip, and you should be all right. The details aren't overly small. Now, it's going to be a case of really just working backwards and forwards. I don't work through one color and then the next at all with this. Having everything on my wet palette just lets me look around the model and work on whatever element catches my eye. So I'm not really doing it with a specific plan of attack. I work to a level of detail where I think it's good enough for me. If I think that it's not standing out enough from a given angle, then I need to work on revising some detail from that angle. Like now, the snout part where there's a little bit of bone isn't standing out as much, so I've gone with a little bit of ivory with a tiny little bit of brown mixed in to highlight that area. Same around the I don't know what you would call it. I wanted to say gills, but it's not gills of the monster there. I just want to pick out some of the detail in the jowl. Perhaps I'll come in with some red between where the mouth is splitting and it would be naturally more fleshy. I've added a little bit of yellow to the eyes, and then we've got this chaos symbol that looks like a scar. I don't know what it is. I was going to make it glow at first, but that would have perhaps been too much considering, and it would have taken some of the emphasis away from Abraxia as the main focal point of this model. Now, it's entirely up to you how much detail you want to add here. I think the takeaway from this should be that, as you can see from my wet palette, it's colors that I've already used on other models that have the same tones, temperatures. I'm not introducing any new colors at this point. I'm really just coming in and starting to reinforce elements, picking out a little bit of detail. Where would the gum line be? Picking out the sharpest teeth where the glow from the lava wouldn't be. Perhaps pulling out a couple of details on some of the scales, drawing emphasis to the monster's eyes. That's where you want the viewer's focal point to be. You want to travel from the bottom of the base up to Abraxia, or from Abraxia, you want it to travel around the model. Trying not to give everything equal weighting. Give some more emphasis to the faces because that's where you've spent a little bit more time painting. Perhaps I want to add some detail to the tongue to draw some attention there because that's quite an interesting element here. So perhaps I'll come in with a little bit of a flesh color and start to add perhaps some micro textures to the tongue, some little lines or some dots. Perhaps I want to pick out under the eye as I'm here. Again, that will help really frame the face a little bit more. I won't go too much into detail on every little single thing that I've done here. I spent maybe half an hour just going around picking out a few little salient details to tie the whole thing together and making the glow effect just in the center point that's a little bit brighter with a little bit more white ink. And other than that, I was ready to call this model done. So shall we take a look at it? What do you think? Well, this is another one that I'm really happy with. I couldn't be any more enthralled with how this has turned out. I'm really taken for it. Normally, I have a little bit of hesitancy around my own work. There's things that when I look at I would definitely change them straight away. But with Abraxia, I'm pretty much very happy out the gate. How we've tied it back to both Eternus and the Sorcerers, we've got that consistency in what we've done that's visually different to some of the other lords, but it has that narrative through thread and it gives us that hierarchy of going from Chaos Warriors to Chaos Chosen up to Lords, all the way up to basically what's his name? Archeon's right hand man and woman, Abraxia, and that other dude that I can't remember his name of, Eternus. That visual narrative comes all the way through, and I'm really happy with it. It just stands out on the battlefield. It's not too big that it's going to detract from some of the other centerpiece models that I'll be coming onto in the final few videos in this series, but it has such a presence. I can absolutely see her leading an army of marauding chaos warriors across the waste plains and just laying waste to everybody, just savaging them brutally with axes and bigger axes and massive blood-drenched axes. It's great. I love this stuff. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one. See ya.